Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners who want to be able to talk about this stuff without wondering how the laws actually work. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. This episode is produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law Section. I'm your host, Anant Raut. I'm excited about today's episode. Today's episode kicks off a series that we're calling Mergernomics, in which we're going to try to demystify the economics of merger review. Antitrust has a lot of math, and for practitioners like myself on the legal side, some of us often only have a high-level understanding of how the numbers are calculated, and that can be a little intimidating when you're paired with or sitting across from a PhD economist trying to talk about their analysis. Each subsequent episode in this series will focus on a different economic tool, test, or analysis that enforcers use to predict whether a merger will harm competition and should therefore be blocked. Today's episode will provide an overview of the role of economists in the merger review process, the common frameworks they employ to evaluate what might happen to competition if a merger goes through, and the tools that they use for their analyses. Joining me today as my co-host is January Kim, who is counsel to the Director of Civil Enforcement at the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division. Welcome, January.
Hi, and I'm so excited to be here today and to kick off the first of this episodes.
Great. January, who do we have on the show today?
I'm happy to introduce my fellow colleague at the Antitrust Division, Aditi Mehta, where she serves as the Economics Director of Enforcement. For all of the cases in our civil portfolio, whether it's in investigation phase or active litigation, Aditi oversees all of the work by the economists and expert witnesses on these matters. Needless to say, she plays a critical role in antitrust enforcement at the division and is probably the most apt person to speak on this topic today. Thanks so much, Aditi, for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, January and Anant.
Given this is the first episode in our series, let's kick off with a question that summarizes what this podcast is all about. Aditi, why do economics matter in a merger investigation or litigation?
Before I start, I should give a disclaimer. The views I express are my own and not purported to reflect those of the Department of Justice. Back to your question. Economics provides a lot of tools and analytical frameworks to think about how to assess a merger. So it's both from a theoretical and an empirical perspective, gives us ways to assess the market facts that we see and be able to model the industry and think about what the potential effects of a merger is to be able to assess the risk of a merger.
At what point of the government's review of a merger do the economists get involved?
At the division, the economists start working day one once we open a preliminary investigation. So there'll be at least one economist that's staffed on a case alongside the attorneys. And so in these very early days, the economists will work with the attorneys to learn how the industry works, and really importantly, obviously, how competition works in these markets. And we do that with the attorneys, reviewing what documents we have at the time and also interviewing industry participants.
Let's talk a little bit more on what the collaboration between economists and attorneys look like. When it comes to the investigative phase, can you describe how the economists at the division work together with the division lawyers?
We are working from the attorneys to help shape the investigation. We, as I said, are learning what the market facts are, and we'll use those market facts to think about what the framework should be for thinking about this merger, which helps us identify which documents and which data are going to be most important for assessing the potential effects from the merger, and bringing our economic tools to bear to think about what modeling may be useful, what empirical tools may be useful, and thinking about what kind of evidence we need to gather to be able to assess the merger.
How does this differ when it goes to the litigation phase?
A lot of the work is going to remain the same. We're still working to shape the narrative of the case and think through how different pieces of evidence fit into the story of how the merger affects competition and outcomes. But we're in litigation, so a lot of our focus is going to be working with the government's economic expert predominantly. That's sometimes an internal economist, but often we're hiring an academic or a consultant. So the economists at the division will help work on expert discovery and prepare the expert for trial. And then we'll also be reviewing what the other side's expert says and helping craft questions to cross-examine the other side's expert.
All right, Aditi, before we get into all of the specific economic tools, it would be helpful to discuss how economists set up the big picture in understanding how a merger affects competitions. To start that discussion off, can you explain the different economic frameworks economists consider when looking at a merger? Also, what are some of the more common frameworks?
The starting point is going to be to learn if the firms often compete directly with each other, and meaning they provide the same product or service. So you early on in the investigation may see that these firms consider each other when they're making strategic decisions, or you talk to customers and you hear that when they're making purchase decisions, they view these two products as substitutes, or they consider both products when they're making their decision. If you see that early on in the investigation, then you're predominantly thinking about two different frameworks. One is a loss of head-to-head competition, and the other is an increased likelihood of coordination.
We just said a phrase that might be unfamiliar to some of non-antitrust professionals. When you mentioned head-to-head competition, what does that mean, and how does that help you evaluate a merger?
I think it's useful to think about a really simplified example. So imagine that there's a neighborhood that has two coffee shops. We'll call one Tasty Joe and the other Coffee Queen. And locals in the neighborhood like their coffee. And when they're choosing where to get a cup of coffee, those are usually the two coffee shops that they're considering. And the way they make their decision on which coffee shop to go to can be based on price, the quality of service they receive, the taste of the coffee, or other factors. So if we start hearing that from customers, we may also think about how these different coffee shops are making decisions. But when we start to look at documents or talk to people at the coffee shops, we realize that when they're making decisions on things like prices or promotions, they're looking to see what the other coffee shop is doing and sometimes responding. And then we may even do more investigation and learn that one of the coffee shops actually offers a Wednesday special on their cold brews only because the other offers a buy one, get one free iced coffee on Wednesdays. So if we see this fact pattern, we'd say that they're competing head to head.
Okay, I love that example because I'm an avid coffee drinker. What is the concern when there's a loss of head-to-head competition?
So what you may see pre-merger in this instance is when one of the coffee shops is worried about losing customers to the other coffee shop, and that's what causes them to not increase their price or even decrease their price. That's why they offered the promotion, because they don't want to lose customers to the other coffee shop. They may hire more people to work at the coffee shop than they otherwise would have to make sure that their service is very good. Post-merger, though, they aren't going to be worried about losing customers to the other coffee shop, and so they're going to have less of an incentive to keep prices down or improve quality or offer these promotions, for example. And so you worry that with the merger, because they're recapturing some of the sales, they're not going to be as incentivized to offer customers lower prices or better quality. Going a little beyond the coffee shop example, here price and quality are particularly important. You can imagine in other settings where things like innovation or investing in R&D are how firms are responding to competition. And because of a merger in those types of industries, you may worry that a loss of head-to-head competition would lead to less innovation, for example.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. You also mentioned coordination earlier as another framework. Can you explain what that is?
So another thing we look for when we see this loss, when we see that the firms are competing pre-merger, is that we may worry that post-merger, there's an increased likelihood of coordination. In this, we're thinking about post-merger, the remaining firms in the market have more, are going to be better able to coordinate on things that matter to customers, like prices or quality or product features. They may even allocate customers so they don't have to compete over individual sets of customers. And so there's a variety of different factors that you look at when you're thinking about whether a merger is going to increase the likelihood of coordination. Some things are, is this a highly concentrated market? Meaning, are there only a few competitors out there? Have there been prior attempts to coordinate? Or maybe is there an elimination of a maverick? So a maverick is a firm that's a disruptive presence in the market. So it might be useful to go back to our example about the coffee shops. So let's say in addition to Tasty Joe and Coffee Queen, there was a startup coffee truck in the neighborhood. And this startup coffee truck has lower costs and they just have a different business model because they don't have to rent out a space. That may mean that they have a better ability to offer promotions or disrupt in other ways any coordination between Tasty Joe and Coffee Queen. So now let's imagine a different merger. Here, Tasty Joe buys the startup coffee truck. So here, the merger could lead to increased coordination between the two remaining firms, Tasty Joe and Coffee Queen, because it's getting rid of this kind of disruptor in the market. And if you see this set of facts, you may think that the merger actually may lead to an increased ability to coordinate, and that might be our concern with the merger.
I totally see what you mean by coordination is more likely in a more concentrated market. Just to clarify, not all firms proposing to merge directly compete head-to-head. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
And in those cases where it's not head-to-head competition, what are some of the other frameworks that economists consider?
I think we can briefly talk about three of those other frameworks. One's an elimination of a potential entrant. The second is limiting access to products or services that rivals use to compete. And the third would be entrenching a dominant position.
All right, let's take each of these three frameworks in turn. First, what does it mean when a merger eliminates a potential entrant?
So there we're thinking about a situation where one or both firms would have entered or expanded in a market that would have led to direct competition, if not for the merger. So in this case, you're not going to see perhaps direct head-to-head competition pre-merger, but you see some evidence that there's reason to believe that if not for the merger, they would be competing head-to-head. So I think, again, it's helpful to go back to our example. So let's say there's a completely new merger in this very merger-heavy industry where Tasty Joe is buying out a popular tea shop in the neighborhood. And through the investigation, you learned that the tea shop was thinking about starting to sell coffee, right? They had made some announcements that they were going to start selling coffee. So in that case, if not for the merger, Tasty Joe would have had to compete with this tea shop who was going to start offering coffee. But because they acquired the firm, they don't have to worry about that anymore because the threat of the entry is gone. And so that could lead Tasty Joe to increase prices or decrease its quality. And so I think what's tricky here is you don't see the direct head-to-head competition beforehand, but you would expect to see it if it weren't for the merger.
You had also touched on how a merger can limit a rival's access to products or services that's necessary to compete. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
This can manifest in different ways. It could be that the merged firm denies access to key features of a product or worsens the term on which rivals can access the product. And this makes it harder or more costly for the rival firm to compete. And they become less of a constraint on the merged firm, and the merged firm can increase prices or decrease quality because they don't have to worry about this competitor as much as they did pre-merger. So again, we can go back to our coffee shop example, and I'll take a very extreme example. So now let's say the merger on the table is that Tasty Joe is buying the only company that produced coffee cups. So now post-acquisition, after the merger, they can limit their rivals' access to coffee cups, either by increasing the price or just making it so that the rivals can't get coffee cups. And that's going to make their rivals less of a competitive constraint, which would allow Tasty Joe to be able to raise its price. So that's a very extreme example. But I think some of the things that you look for is how many substitutes are available for the necessary service that's needed to compete. So in this case, coffee cups, right? Coffee cups are really important when selling coffee. And in my very extreme example, there were no substitutes available for that firm that was being acquired. It's both important what substitutes are available, what other options are available to the rival firm for this service that's necessary, and also how important is that service, right? So here, coffee cups are really important when you're trying to sell coffee. And then another thing that can be really important is how important is the competition between Tasty Joe and its rivals, right? So it's disadvantaging its rivals, but that only matters if the competition between Tasty Joe and its rivals is leading to lower prices or higher quality, or that competition is significant.
That really helps explain what the issue is here between a dominant manufacturer working with a customer, for example. You had mentioned another economic framework called entrenchment. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So a merger can entrench or extend a dominant position. So again, like the previous discussion, this can manifest in many different ways. So one example is if the merger increases switching costs. So pre-merger, there's a product that easily allows you to switch between two different products. If post-merger, one of the firms buys this product that helps you switch between two products, it's going to decrease competition between the two products. And that can lead to higher prices because, again, the other firm's not going to be as much of a competitive constraint. So that's just one example. There's a variety of different ways that this can manifest.
Now I want to move on to a hot topic these days, platforms. How do economists analyze mergers involving platforms?
So this comes up a lot in tech markets. It can come up in other industries, but that's where we're seeing it a lot. And so platforms provide different products or services to two or more different groups or sides who may benefit from each other's participating. And so when we're looking at these mergers that involve platforms, we're looking both at how the merger affects competition on a platform as well as competition between or among platforms. It's a lot of the same factors that we've discussed above. I'm not going to spend more time on it, but just important to think about whether this involves platform competition when you're assessing the riskiness of a merger, because some things can be slightly different in how you think about different issues.
And speaking of hot topics, antitrust agencies frequently highlight the importance of protecting competition in labor markets. First off, what is a labor market? And secondly, why does it matter?
Yes, labor markets are just the flip side of what we've been discussing above. So when you're thinking about labor markets, it's going to be a merger between competing buyers, who in this case are employers, and which can harm sellers, who are the workers. And so if there's a merger between two employers who compete significantly for a certain set of workers, that could lead to lower wages or slower wage growth or make the benefits offered worse or make working conditions worse. So for example, the division successfully blocked the merger of major publishers Penguin, Random House, and Simon & Schuster in 2022 because the merger would have led to less competition to acquire manuscripts, which would have likely depressed the amount of compensation offered to authors. So that's a case that we brought related to labor markets.
And speaking of hot topics, antitrust agencies frequently highlight the importance of protecting competition in labor markets. First off, what is a labor market? And secondly, why does it matter?
Yes, labor markets are just the flip side of what we've been discussing above. So when you're thinking about labor markets, it's going to be a merger between competing buyers, who in this case are employers, and which can harm sellers, who are the workers. And so if there's a merger between two employers who compete significantly for a certain set of workers, that could lead to lower wages or slower wage growth or make the benefits offered worse or make working conditions worse. So for example, the division successfully blocked the merger of major publishers Penguin, Random House, and Simon & Schuster in 2022 because the merger would have led to less competition to acquire manuscripts, which would have likely depressed the amount of compensation offered to authors. So that's a case that we brought related to labor markets.
Wow, there are just so many different frameworks economists use to evaluate a merger. Just to be clear, more than one framework can apply to a merger, right?
That's right.
Now that we've covered how economics helps set the stage on understanding the big picture, or what market structure applies to the merger and how that market functions, let's dig into the specifics of the data economists assess and what analytical tools are used. First, what are the types of analysis frequently used by economists in merger investigations?
So the first thing I just want to stress is that we're doing a risk assessment in merger review. So we do have a set of analyses that we frequently do in mergers, but they're not going to give us an exact prediction of what's going to happen. It's going to give us a sense of how incentives are going to change and what the likely outcomes are going to be in a more general sense. So one thing that you see across almost all antitrust merger cases is an assessment of market shares. So we will analyze market shares. That's helpful in thinking about how competitive the market is pre-merger and also how much is the market structure changing post-merger to help get a sense of what you would expect the effects of the merger to be. Another set of analyses that you see across a large variety of the frameworks that I previously discussed is going to be different analysis that helps get at how customers view these different products and how substitutable they are. So there's two commonly used types of data used for this type of analysis. One is win-loss data, and the other is switching data. So these types of data provide information on who customers considered when making a purchase decision and where customers went when they changed firms.
Didn't the government rely on this type of data in the Bazaar Voices acquisition of Power Reviews? That case, I remember, involved the only two providers of ratings and review software in the industry. Aditi, can you describe what these products are and how the data was so important in evaluating this merger?
Ratings and reviews are when you're shopping on a retail website or looking at a manufacturer's website. You'll see some reviews posted there. This was the software that helps companies have those reviews on their website. So the government's expert looked at Bazaar Voice's data on sales opportunities. So this is just data that Bazaar Voice kept in the regular course of business. And what that data showed was that on sales opportunities that Bazaar Voice ultimately won, it often knew that the only competitor was Power Reviews. So that gives you a sense of how the firms were competing pre-merger. Bazaar Voice was looking at Power Reviews, presumably because it was worried about losing customers to Power Reviews. And so you would imagine that the merger would have a significant effect because they're not going to have to worry about that anymore.
My understanding is that switching data was evidence used by the DOJ in a challenge of the proposed acquisition of TaxAct by H&R Block, these entities being two providers of digital DIY tax preparation software. Aditi, does evidence of customers switching between two merging parties on its own sufficient to evaluate the potential effects of a merger? Or do you need more information to explain that switching behavior?
One important issue that came up here was that when looking at this type of data and doing this analysis, it was important to think about why people were switching. So sometimes people switch to a product not because of price, but because of something else changing in their life. And if you want to use this analysis and interpret it for what would happen for a merger, it's important to think about why people are switching. So when there's a merger, you think the merged firm may increase their price. They won't do that if they're worried that they're going to lose customers to lots of other products. But if people only switch to other products because something else happens in their life or there's some other reason to switch that's not related to price, then you wouldn't expect people to switch from a small price increase from a merger. So in that case, it's just important. The thing to highlight is I think it's important to think about why people are switching when you're doing this type of analysis to make sure that you can use the results to think about what's going to happen because of a merger, or what the effects of a merger would be. There's also other useful sources for this data and analysis that looks at how customers switch and who they switch between. So some companies keep customer surveys in the regular course of business. Sometimes economists look at how customers react or what they do in response to a price increase. So let's say there was a price increase in the past, you may see where customers went or what they did in that case. Market shares can also be useful for this analyses of substitution because they tell you how popular a product is, which can be informative. And then in some bid markets, you look at the closeness of bids. So when different firms were competing for a customer's bid, how close were the bids that they offered can give some indication of how close these two firms are in offering similar products or products that are substitutes for each other. All of these analyses get at how close substitutes to products are. And one thing that you'll often hear when we're doing merger analysis is something called the diversion ratio. And all of these analyses go into estimating the diversion ratio, which measures how likely it is that customers would substitute between two products. Specifically, it's the fraction of unit sales lost by the first product due to a change in terms, such as an increase in its price, that would be diverted to the second product. So that's something you'll hear when you're hearing about analyses that are done in merger review. The diversion ratio will come up frequently.
A lot of the analyses you just covered touched on what's happening currently in the market or analyzing that. Are there any empirical tools that are predictive that's used to assess the merger's impact?
So there are tools. And so again, here I want to stress that even if they spit out what the predicted price increase is going to be, they're really estimates and rough estimates because you have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions. But there are a few tools that we use. One that you'll see come up frequently is something called the GUPPI, or the Gross Upward Pricing Pressure Index. This requires an estimate of diversion, which we just talked about, and margins. And so using the estimate of diversion and margins, the GUPPI provides information on a firm's incentives to increase price. So this has been used in various litigations, including the Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster merger discussed before. Another tool that's similar is something called merger simulations. And so again, this is using some version of diversion and margins and potentially additional information. And it tells you, makes a prediction typically of what the price increase will be because of the merger. The thing to note about merger simulations is that they can just take on a variety of forms, and it's really important to understand how the industry works when you decide which model of merger simulation is most appropriate to use. And for example, if you learn that the prices are set through an auction, you use a different version of the merger simulation than if prices are set through bargaining or firms just post a price. But in all of those models, you make a lot of simplifying assumptions so it's important to get as many assumptions as you can that fit the industry, but you have to keep the model tractable. And so that's just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about a merger simulation. They often also don't consider what other firms may do or potential coordination between the firms. Merger simulation has also been used in several litigated cases. For example, they were used in the division's challenge of H&R Block Tax Act, which I just discussed, and then also the division's successful challenge of Aetna Humana to large health insurers.
And I'm excited that you touched on these two tests because these will be the topics of future episodes in these series. So I will definitely be listening to those episodes to learn more about it. Any other analytical tools that you want to mention today?
There are a variety of tools, and again, it depends on what you learn about the industry. Just two more that I'll touch on. One is that for some matters, it can be useful to try and quantify a firm's incentives of taking certain actions post-merger. So we talked a little bit about the framework where post-merger, a firm may deny its rival access to an input or make it more difficult for it to acquire the input or make it more costly. And so there are tools available for trying to assess whether that would make sense for a firm to do post-merger or not. And again, this requires information on diversion and margins because that helps you calculate basically the benefits and costs of taking these actions. Another sort of analysis that you see come up a lot is looking at historical events. So this may be an industry where there's been a previous merger and you're able to get data before and after that previous merger happened. And you look at what happened in that merger and then try and use that information to think about what would happen from this merger. The thing I just caution is you have to be really careful in interpreting these results. So first, lots of things happen in the world that can affect price, not just the merger. And so you have to make sure that you can control for these other factors. And then also you want to make sure that what happened in that merger is the market structure, for example, is close enough to what today so that it's indicative of what you would expect today, right? So is this past event actually a good way to think about what would happen in this current merger or event that you're considering? So those are just some tools. It's a very fact-specific exercise, and so you may see other tools come up in merger analysis.
And we talked a lot about prices today. Are these tools exclusively used for determining price effects?
That's a good question. So these tools do tend to be focused on price effects, but in many instances, the thing we're actually worried about is not an increase in price, but it's a decrease in quality or a reduction in innovation or some other potential outcome. So I think these models can still be useful, even if you're not specifically worried about price effects, because they just give you an assessment of the competitive intensity. So they give you a price effect, that's what comes out of the model. But really, it's telling you how the firm's incentives change because of the merger. And you can interpret that to be like, we don't think it's going to manifest as a price increase, but it'll manifest as a quality decrease instead, or something like that. It can certainly be used for non-price effects, but it's true that what comes out of these models typically tends to be a price change. A lot of these tools we talked about are also relevant for when you're defining the market. So defining an antitrust market, you'll see a lot of these same tools come up.
You mentioned win-loss data, switching data, customer surveys, and various other types of information that economists use. Now I'm curious, where does this information come from?
Most of this information is gathered from the merging parties and third parties through a compulsory process. So a lot of times the data sets that we're using are data that these firms collect in the regular course of business to make their business decisions. And then we are able to get these data from the firms and use it for our merger analysis or for our analysis. There are occasions in certain industries where there's a third party that collects data, and we sometimes get that third party data to do our analyses. One thing I want to mention is not always data sets that we're using. Sometimes the information that we use for our analyses actually come from documents. So for example, in some industries, you may see that business people need to send an email to get approvals if they want to give a customer a discount. And as part of that process, they have to record who else they think they were competing with. So we can mine those documents and get some of the information that we need for the analysis. So one example of this is in the Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster case. So the government's expert used a variety of different data sources, but one of them was actually looking at communications between agents who sell the books and publishers and editors who buy the books. And that gave the expert some data on who was competing for which books and what their offers were. It's an example of using documents to create a data set that was useful.
And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the formal merger guidelines that came out last December. That was jointly issued by the two antitrust federal agencies, the FTC and the DOJ. How are the economic frameworks and tools we discussed today reflected in these guidelines?
So they really explicitly lay out a lot of the frameworks that we've been talking about and mention a lot of the analytical tools and empirical tools that we've also talked about today and how they can be useful when making decisions under uncertainty. I'd say two things about what the guidelines say related to the empirical analysis. One is that the guidelines recognize that you have to make a lot of assumptions, simplifying assumptions when you create these models and when you estimate the models, and that they can generate a range of predictions across different modeling assumptions or data sets. So I think it's helpful in reading the guidelines to think about how to interpret the results as not a precise estimate, but still useful given how much uncertainty there is. The other thing the guidelines acknowledge is that there's not always going to be quantitative tools available to test certain frameworks. So you may be worried in a merger that when we talked about potential entry, the guidelines recognize we may not know exactly how the entry was going to occur, when it was going to occur, which products would have been part of that entry, the future entry. And so I think there's a lot of questions that can be answered by quantitative tools, and there's a lot of questions that cannot be quantitatively analyzed. And that doesn't mean that we can't show that we don't have reason to think that they wouldn't occur. But I think the guidelines lay that out nicely.
Let's turn to policy for a moment, Aditi. There's been a backlash to the so-called over-reliance on economic analysis in antitrust litigation. On a previous episode of the show, we had Michael Hausfeld of the eponymous law firm talk about his observations over several decades of a shift in the judiciary from consideration of the testimony of economic experts in antitrust litigation to deferment to economic experts. There's also been criticism from the populist left and the populist right that antitrust economic analyses provide a kind of false precision. And there's been growing concern that the increasing cost of retaining economic experts is just consuming increasingly larger parts of enforcers' litigation budgets. It's even led policymakers like Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota to introduce legislation that would codify certain presumptions into antitrust law simply to make economic analysis less of a cost burden in enforcement. Do you have any thoughts on these current trends and what the right balance a judge should strike in considering an enforcement action against a merger?
I think economists play a variety of different roles at trial. And I think one role that can get overlooked is this just being able to explain how competition works in the industry. And I think especially as you're looking at really complicated industries, this becomes even more important. And some particularly complicated industries, just knowing how firms compete, what dimensions they're competing over, and what the importance of competition in the industry is a useful framing for a judge or a decision maker, because I think it helps orient how the different pieces of evidence that are coming in through trial, both the quantitative evidence that the expert puts in, but also some of the testimony from fact witnesses and some of the documents that the court's seeing, and put that in context and think about how that should affect their assessment of the merger. I think that there's a huge value to that narrative and having that framework put forward so that the other evidence can be seen in that light. That said, I do think experts need to be careful to stay in their lane and talk about what's in their expertise. They have to make sure that the arguments that they're making and the evidence that they're putting forward and quantitative evidence kind of fits in with the other pieces of evidence, the other documents and testimony that are coming in, or if they don't fit in together, have an explanation for why they don't. And then also that their modeling is capturing the important aspects of the industry and making sure that they don't oversell their quantitative evidence and put it in context and show that it's robust. I think there's a huge value. I think it's good to be rethinking what the role of an economic expert should be and how it can be the most valuable for the court that it can be.
January, great overview of the economic analysis of merger reviews. I feel like we really packed a lot in here. What are the key takeaways here for practitioners?
So I'll give one takeaway that I hope people have, and it's just that there's lots of different frameworks and tools that are going to be relevant in different situations. So you have to learn about the industry and what the market realities are of the industry that you're looking at. So you make sure that we use the right framework and the right tools to answer the questions that are relevant for that merger.
And another point to make here, lawyers often take the forefront in antitrust trials, so it's not always apparent to the public that lawyers and economists are equal partners in the government's antitrust investigations and litigation. However, I just want to emphasize that it's because of the close collaboration between the lawyers and economists that the division can say there is a solid economic basis for the cases we bring.
Aditi, January, thank you again for this excellent overview of the role of economic analysis and merger review. And I'm excited to work with your committee and roll out our Mergernomics Extended Universe episodes focusing on the individual tools and analyses that you mentioned earlier on in this episode. For our listeners, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.